Entry 1. Arrival at Ivyshale. The journey here was arduous, though not without a certain rustic charm. The road, hemmed in by towering trees, seemed almost a corridor into another realm. My cart jostled ceaselessly over the uneven stones, but each mile further removed me from the distractions of Callenbridge, its clamor, its gossip, its suffocating familiarity. I came to Ivyshale not to retreat from the world, but to recalibrate my focus. Here, surrounded by nature's unfiltered essence, I intend to rekindle my inquiry into the underlying mechanics of existence. The village is, to be charitable, modest in its proportions. The architecture is pragmatic, stone cottages with steeply pitched roofs designed to shed the frequent rains. Ivy, the titular bane and beauty of this settlement, clings with tenacious vitality to every available surface, its vines knitting the structures into a singular organic tapestry. The locals, while polite in the way of people who neither expect nor particularly desire new arrivals, observed my entry with a reticence that I found mildly unnerving. I have taken residence in the former home of the village herbalist. The structure, though sound, bears the weight of abandonment in its every creak. Its shelves are cluttered with the remnants of the previous occupant's vocation. He's left herbs, empty vials, and scraps of parchment inscribed with notes both medicinal and esoteric. Already I feel the stirrings of curiosity. What manner of mind inhabited these walls before mine? What inquiries and what discoveries? What failures? Entry 2. Observations of the surrounding forest. The forest encircling Ivyshale is a marvel of botanical complexity. It is not merely dense, but layered, each stratum of growth contributing to an overall impression of teeming vitality. The canopy, a mosaic of greens and muted golds, filters sunlight into the fragmented pools that dapple the forest floor. Beneath, an understory of shrubs and saplings jostle for dominance, while the ground itself is thick with mosses, fungi, and the occasional cluster of flowering plants whose species I do not yet recognize. Yet, for all this beauty, the forest exerts a subtle unease. It's too quiet. The birds sing, yes, but their songs lack the continuity one expects. They begin abruptly and cease just as suddenly. And then there is a matter of the stones. Scattered throughout the forest are monoliths, some upright, others toppled, all etched with patterns that defy immediate classification. Their presence hints at human intervention, but the precision of the markings suggests a knowledge that predates the village itself. The villagers grow visibly uncomfortable when the stones are mentioned. And they don't forbid my interest outright, but their circumvention is palpable. One man, an elder named Yarnik, finally broke his silence to warn me. The forest holds its own truths, sir, and they are not for us to unravel. Entry 3. On the subject of auditory phenomena. Last night, as I prepared for bed, I became aware of a sound, a low, undulating murmur that seemed to emanate from the very air. At first, I assumed it to be the natural acoustics of the forest, amplified perhaps by the narrow valleys that surrounded the village. Yet the sound persisted, its timbre too well timed to be random. It bore the cadence of speech, though the words, if such they were, eluded my comprehension. This morning I attempted to broach the subject with Lorna, the midwife, who had previously shown an affinity for conversation. Her demeanor changed immediately. She avoided my gaze and spoke in clipped tones, dismissing my inquiry as a trick of the wind. Others were also evasive. Only Yarnik offered a response of substance, though his words were cryptic. When the wind carries words, it is best to cover your ears. I am not inclined to dismiss the matter so easily. Sound, as any physicist will attest, is a phenomenon governed by clear principles. If it persists, I shall endeavor to record it, both for posterity and for analysis. Entry 4. An encounter of significance. It is with great care that I document what occurred last night, for I am acutely aware of the risk of overstatement. As I lay in bed, notebook and quill within reach, the murmuring returned. This time it was unmistakable. Multiple voices overlapping yet distinct, their tones ranging from plaintive to commanding. They seemed to originate from the direction of the forest. Compelled by a mixture of trepidation and curiosity, I dressed and ventured outside. The village was silent. Its windows were darkened. Yet the voices grew louder as I approached the edge of the woods. And there, just beyond the tree line, I saw it. Some figure, or perhaps a construct of startling irregularity. Its form was indistinct, as though the eye could not fully resolve it. But what I perceived suggested a body composed of interlocking segments, each in constant motion. It did not approach, nor retreat. It simply observed. I confess to a moment of paralysis. The rational mind, when confronted with such irrationale, falters. Yet I forced myself to act, calling out in as steady voice as I could. And the voice gave no reply, but the voices, those murmurs, ceased immediately. Entry 5. Initial hypothesis. I've spent the last 3 days reviewing my notes and conducting experiments to better understand the phenomena I have encountered. Several possibilities suggest themselves. Acoustic anomalies. The sound may be the result of natural resonance within the forest, amplified by the atmospheric conditions. However, this does not account for the observed cessation of sound upon direct confrontation with a forest figure. Cultural artifice. The stones, with their enigmatic markings, may serve as a focal point for rituals or ceremonies, the remnants of which have persisted as oral phenomena. Yet the village reluctance to speak about such matters complicates this line of inquiry. Phenomenological aberration. The figure itself represents an anomaly, perhaps a sentient being, perhaps a projection of forces not yet understood. Its silence is as significant as its presence. I shall continue my investigations with renewed diligence, though I am increasingly aware of the personal toll. My appetite wanes, and my sleep is fractured by dreams I cannot fully recall. Still, the pursuit of this understanding demands sacrifice. Entry 6. A gathering of the Hollow's elders. Tonight I witnessed a convergence of the village's most senior inhabitants, a clandestine affair held within the walls of the decrepit chapel. And the building, long since abandoned to creeping ivy and the soft decay of time, had been repurposed for reasons I can only describe as ritualistic. The villagers offered no explanation when I inquired about the gathering. Instead, they fixed me with stares heavy with distrust and thinly veiled fear. Curiosity overwhelmed my prudence, and I resolved to attend. I approached the chapel under the cover of darkness, taking great care to avoid detection. Within, the air was ripe with scents of damp stone and burning herbs. A circle of elders stood before an altar, their faces illuminated by the sputtering light of burning blackened candles. At the center of the gathering lay an object, a carved effigy, a figure hunched and misshapen, its features deliberately obfuscated, as though the craftsman had sought to efface more than define. Chants filled the air, their pace slow, a dirge-like litany foreign to my ears. It was not merely spoken, but intoned, each syllable carrying a mass that seemed to bleed into the walls of the chapel. My pulse quickened as I recognized fragments of the rhythm matching the murmurs that had originated during the nights in Ivyshale. Could it be that the villagers themselves were complicit in perpetuating this phenomenon? As the chanting reached its crescendo, one of the elders, who I recognized as Yarnik, the reluctant orator, stepped forward. In his hands he held a basin of liquid that shone unnatural in the candlelight, its surface projecting colors that I could sense, yet the eye could not perceive. He anointed the effigy with the substance, speaking words that sent an involuntary shudder through myself. Whatever transpired in that chapel, it was not meant for outsiders. Entry 7. A night of uneasy silence. The murmurs did not return last night. For the first time since my arrival, Ivyshale lay in utter quietude. The absence was disconcerting. Villagers moved about the square with a palpable air of relief, their faces less drawn, their steps less hurried. Yet the very completeness of the silence seemed almost unnatural, an enforced void rather than a genuine cessation. I cornered Yarnik near the well, intending to demand an explanation. He regarded me with an expression that hovered between pity and contempt. "You don't belong here, scholar," he said. "Some truths are not meant for the likes of you." When pressed further, he simply shook his head and muttered, "It's done. Let that be enough." But it is not enough. Termination of the whispers, though welcome, raises more questions than answers. What powers do the villagers wield that they can suppress a force so pervasive? And at what cost has the reprieve been bought? Entry 8. On the nature of the quelling. It is my hypothesis that the ritual I witnessed was not of supplication but an act of binding, a deliberate imposition of will upon whatever malevolent intelligence resides in or around Ivyshale. The effigy, crude yet oddly compelling in its form, seems to serve as a vessel or anchor. Its creation suggests a profound understanding of sympathetic magic, though the villagers themselves show no outward signs of scholarly aptitude. Who, then, taught them this art? Or is it possible that they have preserved knowledge so ancient that it defies categorization? This morning I examined the chapel by daylight. The effigy was gone, though the faint smell of burnt herbs lingered. The basin, too, had been removed, but a faint iridescent stain marked the altar where the liquid had been poured. I scraped a sample into a vial for analysis, though I doubt my rudimentary tools will yield much insight. Of greater interest were the markings on the chapel walls, previously obscured by shadow. They are geometric yet organic, flowing in patterns reminiscent of natural spirals found in shells or galaxies. Were these marks left by the villagers, or do they predate the settlement? Entry 9. The unsettling return. The quiet persisted for several days, and the villagers seemed to regain a semblance of normalcy. Yet, as is often the case with such fragile truces, it was not to last. Last night, as the rain pattered against my window, I was awakened by a sound so faint it might have been imagined, a single note, as if some great stringed instrument had been plucked in the depths of the earth. By morning, the whispers had returned, not as a stridency, but as a faint calling, barely perceptible yet undeniably present. The villagers are tense once more, their movements furtive, their conversations hushed. Yarnik has retreated entirely, his door barred, his window shuttered. It seems the quelling was not a resolution but a reprieve. The murmurs have not reclaimed their former strength, but their persistence suggests a resilience that defies the villagers' efforts to contain them. I am left with a choice: to retreat, as Yarnik advised, or to delve deeper. And for now I will stay. Knowledge, after all, is rarely gained without peril. Entry 10. The possession of Elias Carthune. I find my hand trembling as I commit this to paper. No scholarly detachment can shield me from the horror I have just witnessed. The events of this night defy reason, yet they demand documentation if only to ensure that my mind does not warp them further in recollection. The whispers had grown stronger throughout the day, their quality rising and falling like waves crashing against the unseen shores. Villagers avoided the streets entirely, their doors bolted, their windows contained, and I, foolishly emboldened by my need for answers, ventured into the square at dusk, hoping to discern their source. I was not alone. Elias Carthune, a local laborer known for his affable demeanor, stood in the center, his posture unnaturally rigid, his head askew as if straining to hear some muddled instruction. I called to him, but he did not respond. His eyes, once warm, a vivid hazel, if I recall, were glassy, the pupils dilated to near blackness. His lips moved, forming words I could not hear, and his hands twitched in erratic, insect-like motions. As I approached, the whispers intensified, no longer an indistinct murmur, but a series of fragmented voices speaking directly to me. They were not Elias's words, they were others. Hundreds of them, layered atop one another, a ghastly chorus that seemed to emanate not from him, but through him. I shouted again, louder this time, and he turned to me. The expression on his face will haunt me until my dying breath. His features were contorted, the muscles of his jaw pulled into an impossibly wide grin that split his lips, yet his eyes streamed tears. It was as if his body was no longer belonging to him. It was a grotesque parody of joy masking unfathomable torment. And then it happened. With a suddenness that left me rooted in place, Elias lunged at a young woman, Maris, a weaver's daughter who had unwisely ventured out, drawn perhaps by the same morbid curiosity as my own. His movements were strangely fluid, his limbs bending at angles that defied his perceived anatomy. He seized her by the shoulders, and before she could scream, a guttural voice tore from his throat, speaking in a language that felt like it was a tearing through reality itself. Mare's body convulsed violently, her head snapping back as her feet lifted clear off the ground. A sound, a half-scream, half-gasp escaped from her lips, only to be swallowed by a gurgle as blood poured from her nose and mouth. The light in her eyes extinguished instantly, leaving her as little more than a limp marionette in Elias' grip. And then, as if some unseen thread had been cut, Elias dropped her. He staggered backwards, clutching his head and shrieking in a voice no human throat could be able to produce. His nails raked bloody furrows into his scalp as he screamed, get out, before collapsing onto the ground in a heap. The whispers ceased in that torment, leaving the square drenched in an almost tangible silence. Addendum to Entry 10. The villagers were swift to respond, drawn out of their homes by the commotion. When they saw Maris' lifeless form and Elias' bloodied, trembling figure, a collective of dread swept through the crowd. Yarnik, grim-faced, stepped forward, his cane trembling under the weight of his grip. He said it had begun. His words carried the weight of a prophecy. Elias, though alive, was beyond saving. His speech had devolved into nonsensical babble, and his eyes rolled aimlessly in their sockets. Yarnik ordered him to be taken to the chapel, though whether for containment or absolution I cannot say. Mare's body was handled with an unsettling efficiency, wrapped in burlap and carried away without ceremony. No one wept. No one even spoke her name. As for me, I now remain in my cottage, my door barred, my mind aflame with questions. What force could so utterly consume a man and extinguish another life in its grasp? The possession of Elias Carthune is unlike any phenomena I have ever studied or imagined. This was not madness, nor even the influence of an unbalanced humoral state. It was external, calculated, and devastating. I fear for Ivyshale, and I fear for myself. Entry 11, the marked stranger. He arrived at dusk, emerging from the eastern quarter of the woods. He wore a tattered cloak, its edges singed and frayed, but it was not his garments that drew the stares of the villagers who dared glance at him. It was his skin. Symbols, jagged and intricate, etched themselves along his bare forearms and neck, glowing faintly in the dim light like embers buried beneath ash. They were not tattoos, for they seemed to shift subtly as though alive. Their geometry defined the logic of written language. His eyes, a deep gray like a storm-racked sea, scanned the village square with an intensity that left all who met his gaze profoundly unsettled. He said nothing, but he did not need to. His mere presence seemed to amplify the atmosphere that already cloaked Ivyshale. He positioned himself in the center of the square and stood, utterly motionless as the sky darkened and the whispers began to stir. By the time night had fully fallen, the villagers had retreated into their homes, leaving only the stranger and myself observing from the safety of my window. What he sought, or what had driven him here, I could not fathom. He waited through the night, unmoving, even as the whispers crescendoed into a ruckus that rattled the shutters of my cottage. By dawn the whispers receded, and the man, without so much as a glance around, disappeared into the forest once more. This ritual repeated itself for 3 nights. Entry 12. The event in the square. On the 4th night, the man did not wait alone. The whispers began earlier than usual, their timbre sharper and angrier, layered with an intensity that bordered on physical force. The air seemed to shift, saturated with an unseen presence. The stranger, as always, stood motionless, his eyes fixed on the forest edge as if daring it to respond. But this time it did. It began with a sound, a deep groan like the tortured creak of ancient wood straining under its own weight. And then the forest parted, though no wind stirred its branches, and something emerged. Even now, with the scene still seared into my mind, I struggled to describe it coherently. The creature's form was a study in impossibility, an aberration against every natural law. Its vastness was not merely size, but presence. Its silhouette an amalgamation of thrashing strands, jagged appendages, and what might have been eyes, dozens, perhaps hundreds of them, scattered across its body. Its movements were erratic, as though it were disjointed from time itself. Appendages bent and unfurled, clawed and segmented, yet they never struck the ground. Its skin, or the approximation thereof, was a web of shifting oil-slicked hues, its surface glistening as if perpetually wet. The ground beneath it blackened and withered in its wake, and the stones of the square cracking under the unseen heat. It exuded a scent so vile that I nearly gagged, a noxious blend of sulfur, rot, and something acridly otherworldly. For a moment, I thought the man might flee. Surely, even one so marked, so otherworldly as he, would recognize the futility of standing against such a monstrosity. Yet he did not flinch. Instead, he raised his hand, and the runes on his skin ignited. The light they cast was not harsh, but cold, an uncanny glow that seemed to pierce the darkness surrounding him. The creature halted mid-approach, its massive form leaning slightly, almost inquisitively. The whispers surged, growing so loud and rambunctious that I had to press my hands to my ears, yet the man alone stood firm, unshaken. And then it struck. A tendril thicker than a tree trunk lashed out with an impossible speed, the air splitting audibly as it hurtled towards him. The stranger moved with a well-practiced maneuver, evading the blow as though he had seen it coming moments before it occurred. The tendril slammed into the earth, splintering the cobblestone and sending a shower of debris in all directions. The man extended his arm, and the ruins flared again in intricate patterns. A barrier shimmered into existence, a translucent veil of energy before erupting outward in a shockwave. The creature reeled, several of its tendrils coiling in apparent pain, but they recovered almost instantly. The man countered with exactness, his movements a seamless blend of martial grace and arcane control. Each gesture conjured shapes of light, blades, whips, and barriers that collided with the creature's attacks in bursts of energy. The square became a maelstrom of destruction. Tendrils crashed into the ground, leaving craters, while the stranger's counterstrikes seared gouges into the cobblestones. At one point, the creature's crown of crystalline protrusions began to glow, pulsing with a pale green light. A sphere of energy formed at its center, crackling with arcs of assumed electricity, before it was launched toward the man with a sound like shattering glass. He raised both hands, and the runes on either arm flared in unison, forming a shield that absorbed the impact. Yet the force of the blast sent him skidding backwards, his boots carving trails in the stone. For the first time he faltered, and the creature pressed its advantage. Fronds encircled him, moving with a serpentine mimicry. One snaked around his ankle and yanked him off his feet, while another coiled around his torso, lifting him high into the air. He struggled for a moment, and I was certain he was finished. And then, with an almost annoyed cry, he unleashed a burst of energy that radiated outward in a blinding flash. The tendrils shriveled and recoiled as though burned, and the man dropped to the ground, landing in a crouch. The whispers surged again, this time accompanied by a throaty growl that emanated from the creature itself. It reared back, its form shifting violently, its outline blurring as though it were unraveling and reconstructing simultaneously. The stranger took a step forward, his runes glowing brighter than ever. He raised a hand, and a spear of light coalesced above his palm. He hurled it with all of his might, and the weapon streaked through the air, striking the creature square in what might have been its core. The effect was immediate. The creature's form convulsed, its appendages writhing in agony as the spear of light burned through it. A sound erupted, an ear-splitting wail that sent a shockwave through the square, shattering windows and toppling loose stones. The creature's form began to disintegrate, unraveling into wisps of smoke that shone through blacker than night. The whispers ceased, leaving a silence so profound that it felt wrong in itself. Addendum to Entry 12. Reflections. Even as I write this, my mind struggles to reconcile with what I witnessed. The stranger's power defies any framework of understanding I possess. His movements, his ruins, the very nature of his abilities suggest a mastery over forces I cannot even begin to fathom. Yet for all his strength, the battle was far from one-sided. The creature, whatever it was, fought with the cunning that speaks of intelligence, even malice. Hey guys, Alias here. Hope you like the story. This is another entry into the Ashenbound Universe, this time first-person diary kind of perspective. I thought it'd be kind of fun. This was also partially inspired by The Shadow over Innsmouth, which should be released here pretty soon by H.P. Lovecraft. I'll be putting that out here pretty soon. The last installment of the first Ashenbound novel will also be released here sometime this week. I have it all written out. I've got some of it recorded. But between this and Innsmouth, it's just going a little slower than I would like, but we're almost there. So we should have a lot of content this week for you guys. Hope you all enjoy. I hope you all have a great Thanksgiving tomorrow. Or having a great one today. Or I hope you had a great one if you are watching this in the future. Yeah. Like, comment, subscribe. It all helps. I'm a small channel. Hope you guys have a great time. Goodbye.